Hi, this is Andy. When you think of the word conflict, what comes to mind? And I ask because I've had the opportunity to pose that question to groups around the world. And I don't know, how would you respond? Because what I most often hear are words like stress and arguments and tension and avoid, like run. And rarely do I hear opportunity or disagreement. I grew up in a family where we didn't really talk that much about conflict. I'm deeply grateful for the love and support I had growing up, but learning how to deal with conflict, well, that was not one of the lessons I took away from my childhood. My wife, on the other hand, grew up in a family culture that was quite different. Like when we were dating, they'd had this big fight over dinner, but by dessert, they had it all worked out. And I'm just like, what happened here? So years later, I don't wake up saying, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. I don't love conflict. One of the benefits of experience is realizing we don't necessarily have to look forward to conflict, but we need to be able to deal with it in more productive ways, which leads us to this episode. Today, I'm excited to welcome Amanda Ripley to the podcast. Amanda is the author of one of my favorite books from this last year. It's entitled High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. For those of us responsible for leading teams and projects, learning how to avoid the traps of high conflict and how to get out of them if we're there is critical to our success. In a world of increased political and social polarization, we have a real opportunity to be a force for good instead of just adding fuel to the fire. So I can't wait to share this discussion with you. Hey, quick note, you know how important it is to develop your ability to lead and deliver. That's why you're listening today. But too often, students don't learn these skills until they're thrown into it in the early years of their career. If you know a high school or college-age student and want to invest in them, check out our new e-learning program entitled Getting Stuff Done: Project Management for Students. They can learn how to reduce their stress and thrive with their schooling now, and you'll be giving them a head start to more confidently lead and deliver when they launch their career. Learn more and get a copy for them at peopleandprojectspodcast.com/getting stuff done. Thanks. Let's jump into today's discussion with Amanda about her book, High Conflict. So, Amanda, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast. Oh, man, I've been looking forward to this. Yeah. So, before we get into the book, I'd love for our listeners to learn more about you, because I share a little bit about my family, my wife's family intro, and you mentioned a bit about your family growing up as well in the book. So can you think about any ways that your family culture or early experiences formed how you think about conflict?
Yeah, I grew up with a fair amount of conflict, and unlike your family, my family did not avoid it. But I also think, unlike your wife's family, we didn't always get to resolution, right? So there was a lot of conflict that was unresolved, that was just kind of leaking out in all kinds of directions, and especially between my parents. And my response to that, looking back on it, was to monitor it, to like keep an eye on it. Like I would sit at the top of the stairs and listen to them fighting, which, I do not recommend. It's that crazy. But as a kid, it felt like somehow that would keep me safe. Like I would have some sense of what was happening. I don't know why I thought that, but my brother, who was 3 years older and wiser, would go off into the woods or like play with his Star Wars action figures. And he was more likely to avoid that conflict, right? And so both of these strategies have their pros and cons. But it took me a long time to realize that even as an adult, as a journalist for 20 years, I covered a lot of conflict, right? Of course. And a lot of that, I covered terrorism and disasters and crime. And a lot of that is the same thing. Like, oh, maybe I can keep an eye on this, even though it was subconscious, right? Like I wasn't consciously thinking I could control terrorism, but like subconsciously, I thought, if I can surveil this conflict, that's one way to keep it contained.
That's interesting. I appreciate you sharing that. You make a clear distinction in your book about the difference between good conflict and high conflict. And so I think the obvious question is, how do you differentiate? But I don't want to ask that question. I want to ask, what do they not mean? And this is why I say this. I think I would not have thought of yelling as possible in good conflict. That yelling is a sign of high conflict, okay? And so what are some things that people might think good conflict and high conflict could mean, or maybe some misperceptions? Would you mind taking it from that angle?
Right. Oh, that's a fun way to ask it. So, I think there are certain things that surprised me. So I spent, 5 years following people who understand conflict intimately, people who study intractable conflict, people who work in war zones, but also divorce lawyers and mediators and gang violence interrupters, and all of them understand conflict intimately, but very differently from journalists and from most people. So one of the surprises is that anger is fine. Anger is good. Like in the research on emotion and conflict, anger is a sign that you want me to be better. If you're angry with me.
Yeah.
Contempt is much harder to work with, right? Because what's underneath contempt? Underneath contempt or disgust is the idea that you've kind of given up on me. Like you're not trying to make me better. You're trying to make me disappear from the face of the earth. And that's where we get into really dangerous territory as humans, right? As we know. So that's one interesting distinction. And I think as far as yelling, for some people and families, and we all know people like this, yelling is not a problem. Like that's just expression, But
it's
then
a sign of love.
For other people, yelling for them would be high conflict. Like it would actually be something that would feel very threatening in a way that would maybe make the conflict toxic. So some things are a little dependent on the situation, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And the power dynamics and other things. But there are some bright lines, like anger versus contempt, right? The other surprise is that, there's a lot of negative emotion in good conflict. Like good, healthy conflict has frustration, sadness, fear, all those things. The difference is really that it also has flashes of curiosity and understanding and surprise, maybe even humor, God forbid, or understanding, and then back to frustration, sadness, fear, anger. And you can actually see this in the data. There's a place called the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia University run by Peter Coleman, where he and his colleagues have recorded over 500 painful debates between people who disagree on major issues like abortion and guns and other things. And you can really see the difference. Like some of those conversations are just stuck in negative, hostile emotions, the same ones over and over, to the point where it's just repetitive. And then others, there is this like whole galaxy of emotions, and that's the difference. And people leave the lab when they have that kind of emotion, that kind of conversation, they leave the lab more satisfied than they came in. They ask each other more questions. Do they change their minds? No, they don't. That's not how humans change their minds, unfortunately, from a 20-minute conversation with a stranger. But you don't know. They probably plan
maybe a Facebook post. No,
right. You gotta do that on Twitter, of course. So it's a difference that you can actually see in the data, that movement, right? That sense of you don't know how it's going to end, right? It's not as predictable and rigid.
Yeah. Just make sure I got it correctly out of the book. It also doesn't mean good conflict doesn't mean you have to be a centrist or a milquetoast perspective, right? Yeah, because I think sometimes it could be it has to mean forgiving, and you make it clear it's not about forgiving necessarily either, right?
No, it's not about changing your mind. It's not about surrender. It's not about forgiveness. I mean, those things can be involved, but it's sort of irrelevant. And I think this is one of the most frustrating things is I'm not somebody who shies away from a fight. I'm not somebody, I like tension. I like calling things what they are. I don't. And so sometimes I feel like I have to really explain that, this is not about, we've either got to have what we've got or bipartisan harmony. Like that is not, those are not the two choices. Like that's not even the right dimension. Like it's more like, look, we need good conflict in this country. I mean, in that phrase, good conflict is sort of in homage to what the late John Lewis used to call good trouble, right? Like we need the kind of friction that makes us stronger. That's how we get better. We need more of that in most organizations, most families, most communities. The thing we don't need more of is high conflict, which is the kind of conflict that distills into this us versus them, all or nothing, overly simplistic feud where almost everyone ends up worse off to different degrees.
Yeah. And maybe, I think you said at one point, fighting against our own good. Like we're on the wrong side of the argument. And we don't even recognize, or we do, but we don't know how to get out of it. And so
right. Well, that's the most heartbreaking part of high conflict. Every high conflict I've ever seen, you end up harming the thing that you care most about, that you went into the fight to protect, whether it's your family or your country or your values. And you see this again and again and again. It's diabolical.
Yeah. So to kind of build on that us versus them thing, during the height of COVID, at one point, my wife joined some friends outside of a hospital to demonstrate a certain policy. She took our now 13, 11-year-old along, and someone walked by and they stuck their finger in my wife's face. And this person said to my wife, she goes, and you could tell there's like anger and disgust. At least that's what it felt like to my wife.
Mm-hmm.
I know about people like you. And my,
Mm.
my wife told me afterward, her first thought was like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
You don't know anything about it. But and my wife didn't say anything to her because she didn't want to escalate the issue. But that encounter came to mind when you talked about binaries and groups, that we get into these camps of us versus them.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested for your take. Why is it that it's so easy to get sucked into it? Because we do. And I'd be interested how you, Amanda Ripley, who studied this for many years, how do you catch yourself when you all of a sudden feel the tractor beam pulling you in on this?
That's a good description of it. Yeah. Happens all the time, first of all. And so I think, one of the reasons it's so hard to resist the magnetism of high conflict, of that binary thinking, us versus them, is partly because we've set up a whole bunch of institutions in our society to create high conflict, right? So whether that's intentional or not, that's where we're at, right? When
it raises money,
media,
right?
politics, right? A lot of like punditry. So, that is part of the problem. So having just two political parties, if you actually step back from it, is kind of madness, because, I find myself sometimes generalizing about, roughly 75 million people who voted a certain way in the last election. I can't generalize about 7 people and be fully accurate, right? But 70 million, no problem, right? Like that's like a real trick of the mind. And so for me, honestly, the reason I most want to stay out of high conflict, even just in my own head, which by the way is not a small thing, like that's where it all begins, is because I make fewer mistakes when I'm not in high conflict. Like I make a ton of mistakes in high conflict, even in my own head. I miss things. And there's something, there is something attractive about it. Like I'm not going to say it's always easy to resist, but I guarantee that you make mistakes. All of our normal cognitive biases get much, much more heightened in high conflict. We literally lose our peripheral vision. We know from the research that the more partisan people are, the more political news they consume, the more mistakes they make about the other side, right? So this is how you end up hurting yourself and degrading the things you care most about, because you feel so threatened and you're making so many mistakes, even when you don't need to be threatened in some cases.
Yeah. I think you said in the book that you're a little bit more sensitive to when you hear people say us or them, right? Like even like if a friend were like, well, people like us or whatever. And do you pick up on that more now? I feel like I'm picking up on that a little bit more now too. Just a little bit, I mean, I don't necessarily pick up on it when I say it, but I'm picking up on it more when other people say it,
Yes, way easier when other people, that's where we begin, right? It's like other people doing it. Yeah, I remember it was like 5 or 6 years ago, friends and family members started saying we, referencing a political party, right? Like, well, if we win the House, then blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I'm sorry, did you start working for the DNC and you didn't tell me? Like, I don't even know what you're saying. Like, none of them know you and vice versa. So, there's something galvanizing about feeling like you're part of an alliance against evil. And we've certainly created a lot of incentives for that kind of thinking and rhetoric. But it is really like being under a spell.
This may not even be a fair question to ask you, but I just feel compelled to. Like, are your identities different now than before you wrote this? Like,
It's a great question. You're the only one who's ever asked me that. And I'm like, why has no one asked me this? Because it's way more fun to answer than So
tell me about high conflict.
Yeah. It actually, it wasn't just writing the book, but the whole journey of sort of questioning a lot of things I had assumed, about conflict, about my own role in conflict, about journalism's role in conflict. So that was a big part of my identity, and it's less so now. And I think that's partly because I've just sort of lost the taste for seeing the world through this lens, right? This adversarial lens where everything is simple. And like, if I can just, expose the evil of corporations or politicians or whatever, then it will change. Like, I no longer have that delusion. That's not how change happens, right? So in a lot of ways it's less fun, but I wouldn't change it for the world.
Yeah, right. It's more complicated, and that's part of your whole process too. But there's so many beautiful stories in your book. I think Caleb and Martha might be my favorite, and people have to read the book to kind of get it. But if you think of people who have every reason to be on other ends, other sides of fences and things, and they didn't necessarily change their minds, but
Yeah.
one was a conservative Christian Trump supporter, and one was a lesbian progressive.
Yeah.
And I don't remember what she did, but right.
Yeah.
I mean, on many scales, their identities would be oil and water, right? And
Totally.
friendship, would that be fair to say? I think.
Yeah, I think there's an affection there. And I
Yeah.
think it's an incredible thing to see. So like, just to catch people up quickly, it's basically this wild thing that I happened to be able to observe and ride along for, which was like this group of very liberal, Jewish New Yorkers who all attend the same synagogue in Manhattan, ended up doing a 3-day homestay exchange with a group of more conservative Christian corrections officers in Michigan, most of whom had never been to New York, had never met anyone who was Jewish. So they were crossing a bunch of different divides, and they stayed at each other's homes, and they had hard conversations about big things like immigration and guns. And then they also had dinner and laughed and had ice cream and went to a prison museum. And Martha, she helped start the women's studies program at Smith College, a women's college. And she is a scholar, a feminist, a lesbian, and a New Yorker. So like on so many levels, they had nothing in common. They're, different generations.
Right.
Caleb, was a big supporter of President Trump. He is very conservative, very Christian. And
A closet of guns that he wanted to show her.
Guns that he was so excited to show the New Yorkers, and she was staying with him in his house, right? So he's a reservist in the Marines, like lots of differences. But yeah, they really were able to, after just a few days, which is weird. I mean, it was really striking to kind of delight in each other's differences, and also feel distress, right? Like, I'm not going to say like, oh, everything was great, because that's not how it is. I mean, the beauty of it is, like you said, like Rabbi Rowley said, who was their rabbi, who was Martha's rabbi, they could sit with the profound discomfort of seeing the world so differently. And at one point they started talking about gay marriage, which Caleb doesn't believe in, and Martha had to just get up and leave. And she just, she just cried for a while outside, and she came back, and she told him how she felt. It's not like they were avoiding it or hiding or sugarcoating, but it's painful. It's painful. And we all know this from family members we disagree with about politics. It's really painful to have that wedge open up between you. And yet they were able to just allow that, and still not dehumanize each other.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. They're one of the many great stories in the book. A workshop participant recently told me, Amanda, one of their senior leaders, they now call her the salad lady, and I'll tell you why. She was supposed to be at like a lunchtime meeting. She's supposed to have a half hour in the agenda, and she's told she only has like something like 5 or 10 minutes. And I guess she's like, can't believe it. And she picks up her salad, so that's the salad lady, and just runs out of the room and just all upset. And everyone's like, what's going on? And I thought of the scenario when reading your section on humiliation and emotions, because my guess is she felt disrespected. And maybe you're like everyone else gets their time, but I don't get my time. But what I thought was so fascinating in the book was humiliation isn't as cut and dried as we might think. Yeah. And you learned a lot about emotions as you went through this, right? And so what are some of the top lessons, or some lessons, let's say, on emotions that you learned during this project?
So humiliation is probably the most underappreciated force driving every high conflict I've ever seen. And when people behave in a way, to your point, that doesn't make sense to you, and it seems like just a huge overreaction or even self-destructive, it is really helpful, I found, to look for humiliation, like whether they should feel humiliated or not. Is it possible that that's how they feel? What is the story that they're telling themselves? I recently talked to a politician who's running for Congress, and she was experiencing this with someone on the opposite side of the aisle. She's currently at the state level. And her side was just freaking out. They're like, well, F them, like, this is the way it is. We're just going to plow ahead. And she thought, I just don't understand this. They're not behaving in a way that makes sense. So she invited the woman out to lunch. They had lunch. And sure enough, turned out she had felt disrespected or humiliated by something that had happened. And in that case, it was a misunderstanding. And so they were able to recover, to, communicate better so that some of that feeling went away. That's not always possible, right? But it is really important so that you can understand how not to make it worse, right? So yeah, I think humiliation is a fascinating one, and you see it come out in all manner of ways over and over again. So it's something that I think a lot about now and try to avoid at all costs. So sometimes that means I don't get into arguments with people when there's an audience if I can help it, right? Like, so not on Twitter. I first make them feel heard and understood before I give my perspective, right? Because I know people need to be heard before they'll listen. And you just don't want to make people feel humiliated if you can avoid it. Nelson Mandela has this great quote, which is, there's no one more dangerous than one who's been humiliated, even if you humiliate him rightly, which I love.
Isn't that interesting to add to it? Yeah, that is interesting. The thing that along the lines of what you said, that I feel like I'm becoming more sensitive to is when someone acts in a way that you're like, what was that? It's the cyberball thing you talk about how social pain lights up the same parts of the brain as physical pain, if I understood you correctly on that one. And so even though someone said, well, it was a joke, Amanda, but that wasn't a joke to them, right? It was like a punch.
Right. I mean, again, it doesn't mean that they're right to feel humiliated. This is the tricky thing. One of the stories in the book is about Curtis Toller, who was a fairly high-ranking gang leader in Chicago, where you are. And he spent literally years in a vendetta with another gang over a really painful, heartbreaking homicide that had happened in his city. And part of that was a sense that his group, because this kid who was killed was part of his organization, his gang, and had been brought low, had been humiliated by this murder, right? By another group, right? And so he had a whole narrative in his head about it, which eventually, long story, incredible story, he finds out is not true, right? Firsthand, he meets the guy who did it. So he has to slowly reevaluate that whole story he'd been telling himself. And this is what usually happens when people are able to shift out of high conflict into good conflict, is they realize that the narrative of humiliation, which sometimes they'd come up with themselves, sometimes had been given to them, right, by a conflict entrepreneur or a politician or a leader, right, that those narratives aren't quite true. And it's a very disorienting feeling, right, to realize that. But nevertheless, it's a really powerful emotion that's important to understand. I think like newspapers should have humiliation beats. It should be like a whole focus. Because when you look at you only have to listen to one speech by Putin about Ukraine to see the ways he's responding to perceived humiliation and also framing everything as a humiliation.
Yeah. And you had a statement, and I feel like the more I read, the more I realize I don't know, but emotions are socially inferred. Like, we create them. And so I like to say sometimes the best fights I've had with my wife, she wasn't even there. Right. I'm just like, coming up with all these things, but I could totally be making up this story about humiliation. And that wasn't anything even close to the person's intent, maybe, but just like you make the statement that thoughts and emotions cannot be separated. And that's a lot to reflect on too. So I don't know, anything else on emotions you feel like?
Yeah, no, it's wild. I mean, it reminds me of, there was a study of Holocaust survivors where the women who were interviewed from these camps described how every day their guards would make them make and remake their beds over and over. And it was just, it was ridiculous and it was annoying and all these things. And then the male survivors described the same thing, that they had been forced to make and remake their beds over and over again. And they described it as humiliating, right? So now they both objectively experienced the same thing, but it felt very different, right? So there's a lot in there about identity and gender roles and who we think we are and who's higher and who's lower, and this hierarchy we get into. So I think, it's very slippery, this humiliation business. And it's really important to just recognize when it might be happening and try to avoid falling into that trap if we don't need to.
Right. Yeah, that's good. So one of the strategies that you talked about as a kind of quick hack is avoid the fire starter. So like these people that seem to almost like fan, the flames. And yet there's also contact theory, which is spend more time with people. And so I could see how someone go, oh, I know how to deal with this high conflict. I'm going to avoid them.
Yeah.
And there's probably times where those boundaries are good. There's other times where the Caleb and Martha, like, let's find ways. And so I'd be interested in how do you explain contact theory to people? And maybe if you've even personally used it or lessons from it, but how do you navigate that? Avoid or engage?
Right. It's like a paradox, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of paradoxes of high conflict. So, I mean, I think there's a small number of people who are acting as conflict entrepreneurs in any given high conflict. So they're really exploiting and inflaming conflict for their own ends, whether it's for profit or power, or actually, maybe even more often it's for a sense of importance, attention, belonging. Those are very powerful drugs, right? And you have people who, because of their own damaged history that they haven't dealt with or haven't been able to deal with, are just kind of spreading the pain around. And so this isn't that common, but there are certain people who really have a pattern of being always feeling like the victim, always, resorting to blame, recruiting others to their cause. That's a special category of conflict entrepreneurs. And we are all capable of being conflict entrepreneurs, especially now when there's a lot of rewards for high conflict entrepreneurs. But that's kind of a special category. And everyone I followed who shifted out of high conflict, whether they were a politician I followed in California, or the former gang leader Curtis I mentioned in Chicago, or even an activist, environmental activist in England, a guerrilla member in Colombia, all of them, one of the first things they did was to distance themselves from the conflict entrepreneurs in their orbit, right? Whether it's, who's in their news feed or who's on their legal team or whatever the case, it's noticing who is that person and can I create some space? Yeah. That said, for everybody else, right, who is not actually the one really inflaming the conflict, for Caleb and Martha, neither of them, they were kind of part of this bigger conflict system. Yeah. But neither of them was really a conflict entrepreneur per se.
That's good. Right.
So then what you want with contact theory is just the only proven way to reduce prejudice so far. So I wish we had more tools, but we don't, not that are proven like this. In over 500 experiments all over the world, again and again and again, contact is the one thing under certain conditions that seems to help people rehumanize each other and not fall into these false binaries, right? Yeah. And some of those conditions are, you want to try to have equal footing or equal power, if not in the world, which is really hard, then in the room, right? Whenever this contact is happening. So, and you also want to be trying to solve another problem ideally. And, there's other things you want to make sure, so there's some guardrails. Now, in the case of Martha and Caleb, when they did their sort of cultural exchange, right? There was a Simon Greer was the person who brought both groups together. So he was trusted by both sides, which is really important. And he set a number of rules in place, which they all agreed to before they started. And I love these rules because I think we could all benefit from them. But one is, we're going to stay curious. We're going to respect what each other holds dear. And we're not going to try to persuade.
Yeah, that's good. Because
that's not how persuasion works. Now, it's worth noting that all of those got violated, right? Which is always how this goes. But that's okay, because then you can come back to it and be like, oh yeah, sorry, I'm not trying to persuade. But you have certain kind of guardrails up so that the things are going to go better. Now, were they perfectly equal from a power point of view? No. I mean, there were differences on both sides, right? But having that kind of space where they could get to know each other and engage in activities that were meaningful and have honest conversations was the key. And the thing that most people, and I wouldn't have believed this until I saw it, honestly, once you have that experience, you want more of it. Yeah, and it's very surprising, that's why I end the book with Martha, who says, I wish I could appear everywhere in my life the way I felt called to appear there. Present, open, able beautiful to be surprised. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe an action somebody could take after listening to this and reading the book is say, find someone who's remarkably different from you at work and take them out to lunch. You're not trying to persuade, right?
Get
You're
curious.
not, yeah, just, you just get curious and just tell me more, right? Just tell me more.
And there are organizations to help you with it. Like Braver Angels is one that works across the political divide, but they have a bunch of like, workshops where it's set up this way, right? With these things in mind. So they're creating good conflict on purpose.
Yeah, that's cool. When I read about looping, I thought, well, I know about active listening, but it feels like it's more than just active listening. So you knew about active listening before you did this book project. Is there anything you do differently now when you think of looping than because most of us have heard of it, but what do you do differently now?
Yeah, this has been the single most transformative change I've made in my like professional and personal life. So every interview I do now, every conversation I have that's got any heat in it at all with my husband, with my kid, with my friends, I do this looping thing. And you're right, it is more than active listening. It's something I learned from Gary Friedman, who's the conflict mediator expert in the book. And he basically, and I've trained, hundreds of journalists on this and other people. It's a lot of fun to teach, I have to tell you, because people go in super overconfident, just like I did.
I know how to do this.
And they really are not good at it, which they figure out very quickly. And then they get much better, which is cool to see. But you're listening to the other person and you're trying to figure out what matters most to them. And then you're distilling that into the most elegant language you can muster, playing it back for them. And then, this is the piece I used to always forget, check to see if you got it right. So you're not robotically repeating what they said, right? That can be really condescending. But you're really demonstratively trying to prove unequivocally that you're trying to get them, even as you disagree, right? And it is amazing the effect it has on people, even if you don't get it right, which is true like 50% of the time. People, their whole expression changes. Their shoulders go down, they're less guarded, they say less extreme things later. There's a lot of research on this, that people only feel heard about 5% of the time. But when they do, you're going to get much more interesting, revealing material from them, right? And vice versa. You might actually learn something you didn't know.
Yeah. And of course, you don't have to agree with them, right? It's just, can you say it in a way? It's almost like, can you say it in a way that they're like, huh? Well, I mean, I wish I would have said it that way, right? I mean, it's like you're saying exactly. it's so hearable. That was a word I took away from your book. That, in fact, I was working with a group of doctors yesterday, and we talked about this. Are we making what we're trying to say hearable? Yeah. And that means we have to communicate it. First of all, we have to listen to know, and so that hearable idea. Right?
Yeah, and it's amazing how much that comes up. I had a lot of people reach out to me after the book came out from totally different walks of life and different professions. I mean, somebody who does IT work at a big company, he's like, it is so easy for me to make someone feel humiliated by telling them to like reboot their computer.
Did you turn it off and on again?
Yeah, and he's like, so my tone really matters, and it's important that I really listen to them. And there's all these things, right, that we don't even normally realize we're doing that can really make things much harder than they need to be, right? And some of that can be interrupted with looping or sort of deeper listening.
Yeah. So you made a comment in the book that it's one of the many counterintuitive things that we need to complicate the narrative early and often. Complicate the narrative, which I feel like everything we've been taught is simplify, boil down. And so any comment that you'd make about that? And then people have to read the book to get more of it. But what do you mean by that, to complicate the narrative?
Yeah, I know it's a controversial statement, I'll be honest. I've noticed. But so this is really for when you're in really dysfunctional conflict, especially like we are in as a country in politics right now. So in that environment, real complexity becomes oversimplified.
Right.
And all the research shows that the only way out of that trap is to complicate the narrative, right? So what does that mean? Well, first we have to know what the narrative is. So when I talk to journalists about this, but it would be true for any organization, it's like, what is the narrative of your employees about this problem? And then what is the, report it out. If the narrative of my audience is that people who voted for Trump are 100% all racist, then just to take an example, if that's the narrative of many of my readers or listeners, okay, now go out and do the reporting. Listen, talk, ask questions, get super curious. Find out, there's this kind of person, there's this kind of person, there's like more than one kind of person, right, who voted for Trump or voted for Biden. Like it's not one thing. So you're not going to be able to talk to 70 million people, but can you at least talk to 70 or 7, right? And really listen and prove you're trying to get them and figure out they are more than one thing. There are many things. There is racism in the mix, right? In all of this. I'm not saying there's not. And what's underneath that, right? Because if we just stop there, if we just say, well, that's racist, then there's going to be another racist who comes along. Like, what's underneath that?
Yeah.
Where did that start? Like, what is the fear there? What is the sense of humiliation? Or, how did you start feeling like, your group was different than this group? Like, those are the questions, right? And that's the only way we get anywhere interesting in these conversations is first, what is the narrative? What is the real reporting telling me out in the field, like the real data or the real facts? And then where's the gap between that? Because not everything is complicated, right? But people are complicated.
Right.
So
Well said. Yeah. And, the thing I guess I've been watching since reading your book is be suspicious for simple stories. Yeah, that was a quote.
Yeah, anyone who tells you this is why you're feeling sad in the world and here they are to blame. And by the way, there's a million people doing this as we speak on YouTube. Then, beware.
Right.
Because
all you got to do, Amanda, is that's all you got to do.
That's how they want you to feel. They, the corporate media, or they, the politicians, or they, like, this is, I wish it were that simple.
There's so many more things I'd love to ask you about. I'll end with this. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. Can you think of any ways that you and your husband have tried to develop good conflict skills in your son? Any thoughts on that?
Oh, yes. I mean, I use it all the time in parenting. It's actually, that's a great place to practice looping because kids, I don't know about other people's kids, but my kid, especially when he's younger, he's always bringing me grievances, right? There's always some problem that, or complaint, or he wanted to stay up later or whatever. And so it's a really good low stakes environment to practice that looping because what he wants, half of what he wants is to be heard because he's human, right? So maybe I could give him that, even though I'm not going to let him stay up late, right? So really trying to understand what he's saying, play it back to him, check if you got it right. It really diffuses it. And so it may not work the first time, but I promise you it is worth practicing. And it's modeling for them, right? So if you do it with him and then you do it with your husband, and it's like, I've lately tried, I don't always succeed. I mean, this is by far, it's the hardest, I think, in your intimate relationships, right? Because that's where you're most kind of, you think what the other person is.
Right.
And I've been trying lately to really, really get just automatically, without debating it in my head, really get curious and assume there's something here I don't understand. And I may or may not be right, but going into the argument that way, like the other day, to give you a very quick, silly example, I had made a bunch of leftovers, like I cooked a nice dinner and then I was going out of town for work. And somehow it gave me some sense of like, I don't know, like that I was a good mother because I did all this, right? I came back. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And I came back and it was all still there and I had to throw it out. And I was so mad because I felt like, disrespected. Like I felt like, oh my God, I did all this work and you guys ordered pizza. What the heck? It's wasteful, it's gluttonous. I had a huge list of very valid arguments and
very righteous, right?
So, and I think we can all agree I was right? Objectively.
Of course.
But I tried to really be like, okay, let me see if there's something here I don't understand. So I brought my husband in. Now I had laid out all the food that I needed to throw out just as a visual. So
Exhibit A.
I grant you that was a little litigious, but I said, what am I not understanding here? Because I know you and I know you hate to waste food. Like it pains you more than me to throw stuff out. So like, what happened? Right. So just starting it that way,
benefit of the doubt,
led to a much better conflict. Right. And so did I change my mind? Like no, I mean, but I could now hear what he had to say.
That's good. I'm thinking, making sure we don't purposely or unwittingly use humiliation for kids, because they're maybe even more sensitive to it, I suppose.
Easy to do.
Or parents, right. And I'm thinking around the dinner table, how we talk about politics. Are we succumbing to simple answers? So
right.
I feel like little ears are listening, right?
That is such a good point, because right now, I mean, one of the huge changes is that Republicans and Democrats are 50% less likely to get married today than they were when we were kids, which is shocking. And that is a recipe for disaster, because if you don't hear different perspectives in your own home, and you're not going to hear it out in the world increasingly, because everybody's in their bubbles, that's really dangerous.
Yeah. Well, for those listening, this is a book I consider to be a must read. Get a copy of Amanda Ripley's book, High Conflict. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Amanda, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you so much, Andy. I enjoyed it.